There is a truth that most people never learn, a truth that is not taught in schools, not spoken in families, and not even accepted by society. And yet, it governs every relationship, every workplace, and every silent power struggle around you. The truth is this: goodness without awareness is not a virtue, it is a vulnerability. Now ask yourself this one question. Why do the most kind-hearted people often end up being the most used, ignored, or controlled? Today, we will not rush to answer it. We will uncover it, and by the end, you will understand whether your goodness is truly your strength or your silent downfall. In the world you live in, goodness is praised, celebrated, and often presented as the highest human quality. From childhood, you are taught that being kind will protect you, that being honest will earn respect, and that being good will naturally lead to a good life. But what no one prepares you for is the harsh contradiction between moral teaching and psychological reality. Because in the real world, goodness without boundaries does not create protection. It creates exposure. And exposure, in the language of power, is vulnerability. Now understand this carefully, not as philosophy, but as observation. When a person enters social systems, whether it is friendships, relationships, family structures, or professional environments, they are not judged only by their intentions. They are evaluated by their reactions, their limits, and their resistance. In other words, people are constantly testing, sometimes consciously, but mostly unconsciously, how far they can go with you. And this is where the good person unknowingly begins to weaken their position. A person who is naturally kind tends to assume that others interpret kindness the same way they do. They believe that if they are patient, others will also be patient. If they are understanding, others will be understanding in return. If they forgive quickly, they expect emotional balance to be restored. But human behavior does not operate on fairness. It operates on opportunity, and opportunity expands when consequences disappear. When someone is consistently kind without limits, without resistance, without emotional or behavioral boundaries, something subtle begins to happen in the perception of others. They stop seeing that person as a boundary holder. They begin to see them as a safe space for emotional dumping, responsibility shifting, and even subtle exploitation. Not because people are always evil, but because people naturally adapt to what they are allowed to do. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths in Machiavellian psychology. People rarely respect what has no cost attached to crossing it. Think about it. If every mistake is forgiven instantly, forgiveness loses weight. If every insult is ignored, silence becomes permission. If every demand is accepted without hesitation, then refusal is no longer expected. And once expectations shift, respect begins to shift with it. A good person often mistakes this process. They think they are maintaining harmony. They think they are being emotionally intelligent. They think they are avoiding conflict. But what is actually happening beneath the surface is not harmony, it is hierarchy formation. And in that hidden hierarchy, they are slowly moving downward. Not through one dramatic event, but through repetition, through patterns, through small moments where they chose understanding over assertion, patience over position, silence over structure. And over time, these small decisions accumulate into a psychological identity that others unconsciously register as safe to override. This is why in many environments, the kindest person is not the most respected person. Instead, they become the most relied upon, the most expected, and sometimes even the most ignored when decisions are made. Because goodness without boundaries sends a message, even when no words are spoken. It sends the message that there is no resistance layer, and in human behavior, anything without resistance becomes accessible. Now, this does not mean kindness is a flaw. That is a shallow interpretation. The deeper truth is that kindness alone is incomplete as a survival strategy in complex social systems. It requires structure, it requires limits, it requires an internal line that once crossed changes your response entirely. Without that line, kindness becomes unpredictable from the outside, but predictable in one dangerous way. It always yields. And once people sense yielding as a pattern, they begin to adjust their behavior accordingly. They start pushing slightly more, asking slightly more, expecting slightly more. Not all at once, but gradually enough that it feels normal rather than abusive. This is how boundaries dissolve without confrontation, not through rebellion, but through permission. And the most important part of this entire dynamic is that it does not feel like loss in the moment. Each act of kindness feels justified. Each compromise feels reasonable. Each moment of avoidance feels peaceful. But from a psychological standpoint, these moments are not neutral. They are directional. They are shaping how others interpret your limits. Machiavelli would describe this not as moral failure, but as structural ignorance. Because power is not only taken by force, it is often given away through inconsistency between intention and consequence. A person may intend to be kind, but if their kindness never encounters resistance, it transforms into a predictable pattern. And predictable patterns in human psychology are the first thing people begin to test, not because they hate you, but because they realize they can. And that realization is where the shift begins, where goodness stops being seen as strength and starts being treated as availability. In every society, in every group, in every hidden structure of human interaction, there is a silent rule that most people never speak out loud, yet everyone subconsciously follows. And that rule is simple. People do not respond to what you believe you are. They respond to what they believe you can do. This is where the illusion of virtue begins to collapse under the weight of reality. Because virtue, in its purest form, is internal. It is about intention, morality, and personal values. But human behavior is external. It is shaped by perception, reaction, and consequence. And perception does not reward purity, it rewards power. Now, when we say strength, we are not only talking about physical dominance or loud authority. Strength, in the Machiavellian sense, is psychological structure. It is emotional stability under pressure. It is the ability to maintain position when tested. It is the presence of consequences behind your boundaries. Without consequences, virtue becomes symbolic, and symbols alone do not control behavior. They inspire, but they do not regulate. This is why two people can act in the same kind way, but receive completely different treatment. One is respected, the other is overlooked. One is considered valuable, the other is considered available. The difference is not morality. The difference is perceived consequence. When a person consistently behaves in a way that never creates resistance, never enforces a limit, and never produces emotional or social pushback, others begin to unconsciously categorize them as non-threatening. And in human psychology, non-threatening does not automatically mean respected. It often means disregarded. Because respect is not born from agreement. It is born from awareness of cost. Think about how people behave in environments where consequences are clear. In structured systems, whether it is a disciplined workplace, a strict leader, or even a high-status individual, people adjust their tone, their behavior, their language. Not because they suddenly became more moral, but because they became aware that actions carry weight. Now compare that to environments where consequences are unclear, where boundaries are flexible, where forgiveness is immediate and unconditional. Over time, people begin to stretch behavior in those spaces, not always out of malice, but out of psychological testing. They test how far things can go. They test what is acceptable. They test what is ignored. And every time nothing happens in response to a boundary being crossed, the mind records a simple conclusion: there is no cost here. This is where Machiavelli's hidden truth becomes uncomfortable. Because in his understanding of power, morality without enforcement is incomplete. Not because morality is wrong, but because morality alone does not shape behavior in others. Consequence does. A person can be deeply virtuous, but if that virtue is not supported by structure, it becomes socially weak. It becomes something people admire but do not adjust for. They may say, "You are a good person," but their behavior does not reflect respect. Instead, it reflects comfort, and comfort without respect leads to imbalance. This is why in many real-world dynamics, the most ethical person in the room is not always the most influential. Influence is not given to the purest intention. It is given to the clearest boundary. Strength communicates something that virtue alone cannot. It communicates predictability under pressure. It communicates that actions have outcomes. It communicates that there is a line, and crossing that line will change the interaction. Without that message, even kindness becomes unanchored. It floats in perception without structure, and anything without structure is open to reinterpretation. And humans are experts at reinterpretation when there is no resistance. This is why, over time, people begin to shift their behavior around those who lack consequence. They interrupt more. They demand more. They assume agreement more easily, not because they consciously decided to disrespect, but because the environment trained them to. And this is the silent transformation that happens in relationships and social circles. It rarely starts with disrespect. It starts with absence of correction. It starts with tolerance that goes unmeasured. It starts with kindness that never turns into firmness when needed. And eventually, that creates a perception gap. On one side, the person believes they are being understanding, patient, and good. On the other side, others begin to unconsciously treat them as flexible, adaptable, and easy to move around. That gap is where respect quietly disappears. Because respect requires psychological weight. It requires the understanding that actions matter, that behavior has consequences, that interaction is not one-sided emotionally. Without that weight, even the most virtuous behavior loses its authority in social perception. It becomes soft influence instead of structured presence. And structured presence is what human psychology naturally aligns with. This is why strength and consequence are not opposites of virtue, but frameworks that protect it. Without them, virtue becomes vulnerable to reinterpretation. And once reinterpretation begins, respect begins to shift toward those who demonstrate control rather than those who demonstrate purity. In the hidden layers of human interaction, there exists a pattern that most people never consciously recognize, yet almost everyone has experienced at some point in their life. It is the pattern of being slowly influenced, gradually pressured, and subtly guided into positions that were never openly demanded, but somehow still accepted. And at the center of this pattern lies a simple truth. Manipulation does not begin with force. It begins with perception. More specifically, it begins with the ability to identify who will hesitate, who will empathize, and who will remain silent in moments where clarity is required. A manipulator does not look for the strongest person in the room. They do not look for the loudest voice or the most dominant personality. They look for something far more valuable in their strategy. They look for emotional accessibility. They look for the individual who reacts with understanding even when boundaries are crossed. They look for the person who gives space even when space is being taken away. They look for the one who avoids conflict even when conflict is necessary. And once that pattern is identified, the process begins quietly. Not with aggression, not with obvious control, but with small, almost unnoticeable tests. A request that slightly crosses a boundary, a comment that pushes emotional reaction, a situation where saying no would be appropriate, but saying yes feels easier. And when the response is empathy instead of resistance, when the response is silence instead of correction, when the response is hesitation instead of clarity, something shifts in the psychological structure of the interaction. Because in that moment, the manipulator learns not just about your kindness, but about your predictability. Empathy, in its pure form, is a strength. It allows understanding, connection, and emotional intelligence. But in an unguarded state, empathy becomes a channel through which influence can enter unnoticed. A person who understands others deeply but does not regulate access to themselves becomes readable. And in Machiavellian logic, anything that can be read can eventually be predicted, and anything that can be predicted can be guided. Now, silence plays a very different role than most people assume. Silence is often seen as peace. Silence is seen as maturity. Silence is seen as emotional control. But in certain dynamics, silence is not control. It is avoidance of definition. Because when you do not define your position clearly, others will begin to define it for you. And this is where manipulation becomes efficient. If a boundary is crossed and there is no verbal correction, the silence is interpreted as acceptance. If a disrespectful action is not addressed, the silence is interpreted as permission. If a demand is met with hesitation instead of refusal, the silence is interpreted as uncertainty. And uncertainty is where influence grows fastest. Because manipulators do not need certainty. They exploit it. They move into spaces where clarity is absent and slowly establish their own version of reality through repetition. Now, hesitation is perhaps the most powerful signal in this entire structure. Hesitation is not just delay in response. It is visible emotional negotiation. It is the moment where the mind is aware that something is wrong, but the action does not match that awareness. And this gap between awareness and action is where control shifts. Because manipulators are highly sensitive to timing. They do not respond to what you think. They respond to how long it takes you to act on what you think. A delayed no is often more valuable to them than an immediate yes, because delay reveals internal conflict, and internal conflict reveals where pressure can be applied. Once hesitation is detected, pressure does not need to be aggressive. It becomes conversational. It becomes emotional. It becomes framed as guilt, obligation, or misunderstanding. And slowly, the person who hesitates begins to adjust, not because they are weak in character, but because their emotional structure is being engaged without resistance. This is why Machiavellian thinkers emphasize awareness over emotion-driven response. Not because emotion is wrong, but because emotion without structure becomes exploitable. In these dynamics, manipulators are not always consciously evil. Many operate instinctively. They learn through feedback. If a behavior works, they repeat it. If a boundary is not enforced, it becomes irrelevant in their mental map of you. And over time, a pattern forms where empathy is taken advantage of, silence is misinterpreted as consent, and hesitation is used as entry points for influence. The most dangerous part is that from the inside, it rarely feels like manipulation at first. It feels like being understanding. It feels like being flexible. It feels like avoiding unnecessary conflict. But from the outside, a structure is forming. A structure where one side is increasingly guiding the interaction while the other is increasingly reacting to it. And once that structure stabilizes, reversing it becomes difficult, not because it is impossible, but because the roles have already been psychologically accepted. And in Machiavellian truth, roles that are accepted without resistance become difficult to rewrite without disruption. In the deepest understanding of power dynamics, there is a concept that separates illusion from mastery, confusion from clarity, and weakness from strategic strength. It is the realization that power is not found in rejecting morality, nor is it found in surrendering to kindness without limits. Power exists in something far more precise. Controlled morality, not blind goodness, not emotional reaction, not impulsive compassion that has no structure, but a deliberate, conscious regulation of how virtue is expressed, when it is expressed, and under what conditions it is allowed to influence behavior. Most people misunderstand this balance completely. They assume there are only two paths. Either you are good and therefore vulnerable, or you are strong and therefore detached from morality. But Machiavellian truth does not operate in such a simplistic division. Instead, it reveals a third path that very few people ever master: the ability to remain morally aware while behaviorally structured. Blind kindness is dangerous not because kindness itself is flawed, but because it removes discernment from action. It reacts without calculation. It forgives without evaluation. It gives without measuring consequence. And in doing so, it creates predictability. And in human psychology, predictability without boundaries becomes a point of exploitation. When people can predict that you will always understand, always forgive, always adjust, and always prioritize peace over principle, they begin to interact with you differently. Not necessarily out of hatred, but out of adaptation. They adjust their behavior to what is allowed, not what is right. And slowly, without any dramatic moment, your position shifts from participant to responder, from decision maker to accommodator, from structured presence to flexible support. Controlled morality reverses this dynamic. It does not remove kindness. It refines it. It does not eliminate empathy. It places it under awareness. It does not reject compassion. It ensures compassion does not override structure. Because true power understands a fundamental psychological principle. People do not respond to what you feel internally. They respond to what you enforce externally. When morality is blind, it operates purely on internal values. But when morality is controlled, it becomes visible through consistent behavior, defined boundaries, and stable consequences. This is where authority is born. Authority is not the absence of kindness. It is the presence of structure around kindness. A person who is controlled in their morality can still be generous, but their generosity is not exploitable. They can still be understanding, but their understanding is not automatic. They can still forgive, but forgiveness is not assumed, it is evaluated. And this evaluation changes everything in how they are perceived. Because in human interaction, unpredictability of response creates caution, and caution creates respect. Not fear in the emotional sense, but awareness of limits. When someone operates with controlled morality, they are no longer easy to map. Their reactions are not fully predictable because they are not purely emotional. They are not purely reactive. They are filtered through judgment, and this filtering process creates psychological weight. People begin to consider their actions more carefully around such individuals, not because they are afraid of punishment, but because they are aware that behavior is being observed through a structured lens rather than an emotional one. This is the key difference between being good and being respected. Goodness without control is interpreted as availability. Controlled morality is interpreted as presence. Availability invites testing. Presence invites adjustment. Machiavelli's hidden truth is not that morality is weak, but that unstructured morality is unstable in power environments. Because it shifts with emotion, it reacts instead of deciding. It absorbs instead of defining, and anything that absorbs without resistance becomes shaped by external forces over time. Controlled morality prevents this shaping process. It establishes an internal system where values are constant, but expressions of those values are conditional on context, respect, and behavior from others. This does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming calibrated, because in real-world dynamics, people constantly test boundaries, even unconsciously. They test emotional limits. They test forgiveness thresholds. They test patience, tolerance, and silence. And every response you give becomes data for how you will be treated next time. If your morality is blind, the data always points in one direction. More access, less resistance, fewer consequences. But if your morality is controlled, the data becomes unpredictable in a structured way. Sometimes there is understanding, sometimes there is distance, sometimes there is acceptance, sometimes there is refusal. And this variability creates psychological caution. Because people cannot rely on automatic outcomes, they begin to pay attention. And attention is the beginning of respect. At the highest level, controlled morality is not about manipulating others. It is about preventing your own values from being manipulated through emotional exploitation. It is the discipline of ensuring that your kindness does not become a tool against you, and your empathy does not become an entry point for control. It is the understanding that morality without structure becomes reaction, and reaction without control becomes vulnerability in complex human systems. And in Machiavellian understanding, vulnerability is always noticed before virtue is appreciated. The final truth behind goodness, now everything comes together. What you once called goodness was never the problem. What you once believed was kindness was never the weakness. The real truth was always hidden in plain sight. Goodness without awareness becomes exposure. Virtue without consequence becomes ignored. Empathy without boundaries becomes a doorway. And morality without structure becomes something others quietly learn to move around. In the world you live in, people are not always judging your heart. They are interpreting your pattern. They are studying your consistency. They are measuring your response to pressure, your silence in conflict, your hesitation in decision, and your limits when tested. And from those patterns, they form their position toward you. This is why some of the kindest people feel unseen, not because they lack value, but because their value is not framed by boundaries that others can respect. Machiavelli's hidden truth was never an instruction to abandon goodness. It was a warning against unconscious goodness, against emotional generosity without structure, against being predictable in a world that tests predictability. Because in reality, power is not taken all at once. It is slowly shaped through repeated interactions where no resistance is met, where no line is drawn, where no consequence is felt. And by the time a person realizes what has happened, the pattern has already been accepted by everyone involved. So the real transformation is not becoming less good. It is becoming aware while being good. It is becoming conscious while being kind. It is becoming structured while being human. And in that awareness lies the only form of goodness that cannot be easily used, redirected, or diminished in a world that constantly studies how far it can go with you.